back because you came along about 10 years after I did, but certainly during the late 30s, the field seemed to be populated heavily by Jews.
The comic book business was.
That's right.
I don't know what you were talking about before I came in, but comics seem. It always seems that the way I see it is that people go to do the same things in the same circumstances. And that explains why there were Jews in the comic book business. It was a time that the opportunity was there. 20 years later or 10 years before, it might have not been there, that window of opportunity. And I remember music and art high school, where I went to school with about 10 people who I knew for the rest of my life. Now that seems to be very unusual, that you come out of your high school with so many connections. And I came with my connections. Now the reason the connections were there was because there were common circumstances. We came from the same backgrounds at the same moment in time, and I think I've belabored the point.
Well, if I can interrupt you belaboring here, I want to answer one more point. There's a deeper, perhaps a little bit more pretentious sociological answer to the question you raised, Dick, and that is that I believe that the creation of the superheroes, actually most of the superheroes we know were created by Jews. Superman, Batman, Spider-Man, what's that?
Jew-man.
It was a response again to the times, the need for a golem to combat the hostile world. We were passing through at that time historically a period in which Western man really, the cultural man, cultured man, the civilized man, was moving from one enemy to another enemy. Up until that time, his primary enemy was the biblical beasts of the jungle, and he created Tarzan to deal with the beasts of the jungle, or Tarzan-like characters. After Tarzan, the major enemy became man, and the only way to fight against man was the way traditionally the oppressed minorities did it, which is to create a golem, which was a character created by the Jewish community in Prague in the middle 1800s as a result of oppressive pogroms that they felt they couldn't deal with, so they created a bionic man, a golem, who would go out and fight these people. So I think those are the two major forces that created this thing, and I think we see the result of it later on. Everybody inserts their own culture. It's only later on that we become aware of these cultural differences.
Wouldn't be also the fact that ethnic characters almost never sell, and they didn't sell, especially in the 30s and 40s. I mean, there's just
No, that's not entirely true. As a matter of fact, historically, the comics, I'm talking about daily strips. Remember, comic books is a result of a long history of comics. Ethnic characters dominated the comics prior to the arrival of comic books.
Yeah, but it seems to me most of the comic books, especially superheroes, every time I've tried ethnic superheroes, they just don't sell.
Well, you mean a Jewish superhero or a black superhero or a
exactly.
Spanish superhero?
Right.
or a Chinese superhero.
Exactly. They just,
Uh,
you know,
Well,
that would be a major reason for.
well, there's probably, the reason there might be the fact that the reader wants to identify, the superhero becomes an idealization, if you will, of the person who's going to fight for him and destroy these evil forces for him.
It wasn't the attitude in the 40s, well, that you were selling comic books to the 8-year-old Boston kid in Kansas City or
So
something like that?
yeah, well, the gag was a 10-year-old cretin in Kansas City. No, as a matter of fact, that was, the comics traditionally did things, remember, Harvey, all comics said, hinged itself and themselves on crime does not pay. Evil was destroyed in the end. And there was a constant attempt to stay within the so-called social needs of the society as a way of surviving within the community, avoid censorship. But as far as the ethnic thing is, there were no ethnic heroes until later on. It's only in the last few years, Shaft was it, but we had a black kind of hero.
Recently,
What's that?
There's El Diablo over DC, it just got canceled.
I tried in the spirit at one point, in the late 40s, I guess it was, I tried a group of blacks working with Ebony, a black detective who spoke not like a slave, but like and I got very, very weak response on that. I got no encouragement from that at the time. So that kind of, in that area, and in that medium, your ethnic heroes didn't work. But prior to that, between the year 1900 and 1940, comic strips, beginning with The Yellow Kid, which was a shanty Irish kid, Katzenjammer Kids, which were the German immigrants, Abe Kabibble, which was a Jewish immigrant, and so on and so forth. All of them represented or reflected the so-called ethnic communities. And so comics in that medium were more reflective of society. That's the difference between the strips and the comic books. Strips were a social commentary more than comic books. Well, comic books were traditionally providing teenage fantasy entertainment. Initially, it's what it started. That was why we had what we had.
Where does Popeye fit in all this?
And ethnically, I don't know. It's probably it was a wasp.
Maggie and Jiggs.
Maggie and Jiggs were all part. The daily strips were reflective of social life. Popeye was probably reflective, if you look at it, of social life. The daily comic strip cartoonists were, even to this day, are a different breed than the comic book artists. Totally different. They may use balloons and box panels and so forth, but they're reflective of social.
And the comic book artists, as I remember them, were all you. Will was turning out all this stuff, and he affected the style of the people, the tools that the artists, us artists, would use to paint the cartoons. Will was one for the Japanese brush that came to a point and
That's
held
because it was
vertically.
cheap.
Yeah. But you affected that era as much or more than any single man.
Well, since we're flinging compliments around here, let me throw back one at him, and that is, you were talking, Jim, a moment ago about trying to tie responsibility of trends onto two people. The major change in comic books, in my opinion, occurred at two times. One is when Harvey started Mad, because for the first time, the main thrust of the comic book, and I'm talking about the medium itself, the package itself, moved from the fantasy supply, the ersatz adventure and so forth, on to a more realistic or a life-connected material. Once Harvey started doing satirical material, it moved into that direction. So the whole field moved into that, or we moved single-handedly moved it into that direction. The second major change occurred in San Francisco in the 60s with the underground people, I believe.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
Absolutely, although the comics, the history of comics goes like this, and underground comics goes like this. I don't know where it goes.
Well, it's an offshoot. If you're going to broad picture, the whole industry is pretty much, the whole field, like any, unlike most literary fields, it's a tree with many branches. I credit the so-called underground with the literary direction that I'm really very interested in. I feel that is the great hope of comics. We were talking before you came about Jackson's comment, which I found very, very insightful and quite brilliant observation, that the change in superheroes today, because they're beginning to invest superheroes with neurotic dimensions, are probably going to kill themselves. He said, was that pretty much going to kill themselves because they're no longer providing the so-called teenage fantasy that they started out to do. And he, I think, made a very interesting point, except that I think that the field still will exist largely because the needs will be there. And the reason that they are selling is because the need has changed. Otherwise, as you pointed out, they wouldn't sell.
It seems to me that you're leaving out one of the major stages of the change in comic books, and that was, I mean, not that this is an original observation of mine, but the first comic books were reprints of newspaper material, and you as much as anybody else jumped into the gap to do original material for them. And that's, of course, the first big change in major comic books.
Well, that's true, but like I said the other day in one of the other panels, nobody in my studio at the time, I don't know if anyone came to you and said, hey, Harv, you realize that we're in the golden age? We didn't know it was ago. We were responding to needs, just as I believe Harvey, in creating Mad, responded to a need at the moment. I don't know.
Need of my stomach.
Well, all right. But I think you're better equipped to tell. I was always under the impression that you created Mad, or Mad was created because there was a need to take another direction because the EC was under great pressure, of censorship pressure, I guess it was. Bill Gaines was faced with that, and so that suddenly there was an opening, an opportunity for you to do anything you wanted. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, it's that feeling of doing anything you wanted that propelled me into that new wave.